At 86, Jackie Stewart finally reveals the 5 drivers he hated most. There is a photograph from Watkins Glen, October 1973. Jackie Stewart is standing beside a crumpled Tyrrell. His helmet is still on. His teammate, Francois Sever, is already dead, body removed from the wreckage 20 minutes earlier. Stewart will not race that weekend. He will never race again. But the story that ends there is not the one worth telling. The one worth telling is about what he carried out of every cockpit before that moment. The men he measured, the ones he found wanting, the verdicts he chose, for 50 years, to keep mostly to himself. He is 86 now. 3 world championships, 27 wins. A safety crusade that changed the sport while the sport tried to bury him for it. He received death threats. People threw stones through his windows. He lost 57 friends to the track and kept showing up, kept winning, kept watching. And what a man watches, long enough, close enough, eventually becomes an opinion, then a judgment. Then, if enough time passes, a record. This is the record. The first name is not a shock. It is a confirmation. Ayrton Senna was the most talented driver of a generation that had the technology to magnify both brilliance and destruction simultaneously. He won 3 world championships. He drove as though the track belonged to him by divine right. Jackie Stewart watched him for years. In the paddock, across television screens, through the lens of his own considerable understanding of what racing at the limit actually requires. What Stewart saw was not greatness without reservation. What he saw was a man who confused courage with license. In 1990, after Senna deliberately drove Alain Prost off the road at Suzuka to win a championship he could not win cleanly, Stewart did something almost no one in the paddock was willing to do. He sat across from Senna in front of cameras and asked him to account for it. Not politely, not with deference, with the precision of a man who had seen what happens when a driver decides the rules of engagement apply to everyone except himself. Senna left that interview shouting, "The footage still exists. The discomfort in it belongs entirely to one man, and it is not Stewart." He overdrove, Stewart said, long after Senna was gone and the mythology had hardened around him. There were a number of times that he intentionally did things which the great drivers wouldn't have done. Fangio wouldn't have done it. Jim Clark wouldn't have done it. He went further. He ranked Prost above Senna, not in speed, but in completeness, in control, in the quality Stewart believed separated a great racing driver from a great risk-taker. That distinction cost him relationships. It cost him nothing else. Senna died at San Marino in 1994. Stewart did not change his assessment. The second name is more uncomfortable because the man attached to it is still alive, still racing, still occupying a grid spot that other men, hungrier men, Stewart would argue, could be filling. Lance Stroll arrived in Formula One in 2017 carrying 2 things: genuine pace in wet conditions, and a father with the financial architecture to purchase an entire constructor. Stewart watched Stroll's debut season with the particular attention of a man who has spent decades explaining what the car actually needs from a driver. What he saw at the 2019 Australian Grand Prix, he described as a nightmare, not a metaphor, an assessment. "You've never seen such movement," he said. He was overdriving it to such an extent. Stewart went personally to Lawrence Stroll and offered to help. The offer was never taken. The offer was never taken. There is something in that silence that matters more than any race result. Stewart spent his career building a structure of discipline around the act of driving. Smooth inputs, car in balance, elastic always over the middle, never the front or the back. He built it because he watched men die when the elastic snapped. He watched Jim Clark thread a Lotus through corners that broke other drivers' nerve, because Clark never asked more of the car than it could quietly give. When Stewart looked at Stroll and saw chaos in the steering inputs, and money in the garage, he was not seeing a young driver finding his way. He was seeing a fundamental misunderstanding of what the sport costs, not financially, physically. Finally. The third name arrives from a different era, but lands with the same weight. Michael Schumacher won 7 world championships. He is, by one set of numbers, the most successful Formula One driver in the history of the sport. He is also, by another set of numbers, incidents at Jerez 1997, Monaco 2006, Hungary 2010, a man who used the car as a weapon when points were on the line and alternatives existed. Stewart watched Schumacher for years with the grudging respect one professional extends to another who is undeniably effective. Then came Hungary 2010. Schumacher squeezed Rubens Barrichello, a man who had served as his teammate, who posed no championship threat, to within inches of a concrete wall at racing speed. Stewart was in the paddock. Those who were there say he was shaking. "That was one of the most blatant abuses of another driver I have ever seen," he said afterward. "Bully boy tactics." What made the rage specific, and not merely general, was the context. This was not a championship moment. There was nothing at stake beyond the assertion of dominance over a man Schumacher had already, years earlier, dominated completely. It was, in Stewart's framing, pure. And that purity was the most damning thing about it. There were no circumstances to weigh, no pressure to explain the calculus, just the choice. A terrible example from a man who has won 7 world titles. Stewart never softened it. In subsequent years, when asked to rank Schumacher among the all-time greats, he applied the same logic he applied to Senna. Too many collisions with too many people. A driver who would do that, Stewart believed, could not be called complete. Greatness requires the renunciation of certain options. Schumacher repeatedly refused to renounce them. The fourth name is the one that reveals the most about Stewart himself. Lewis Hamilton broke Schumacher's win record in 21-20. He broke it with 7 championships and 103 victories, driving in an era where the car beneath him was frequently so superior that the margin of competition existed largely in the internal dynamics of his own team. Stewart acknowledged the talent, the best driver of the present time, he said, and meant it. What he questioned was something harder to quantify and therefore harder to dismiss. He questioned whether Hamilton's hunger had survived success, whether the fire that drives a man to risk everything had been banked by comfort, by celebrity, by causes that expanded beyond the cockpit. "Lewis no longer has that hunger," Stewart said in a German publication, pointing specifically to the period following Nico Rosberg's 2016 championship. Hamilton called him short-minded. The characterization stung precisely because it was partially earned. Stewart had, in earlier years, been critical of Hamilton's politics, his public platform, the space he occupied outside the car. But the deeper argument was not about politics. It was about what Stewart had watched happen to drivers who stopped being afraid. Fear, in Stewart's taxonomy, was not weakness. It was the mechanism that kept the elastic over the middle. A driver who had lost his fear of losing had lost something structural, something invisible from the outside, something that only showed up, eventually, in the numbers. Hamilton responded by saying he would never speak down to the next generation. It was a clean answer. It was also a deflection. The question Stewart was asking was not about generosity. It was about necessity. The fifth name is the one nobody expected, and that is precisely the point. Jochen Rindt was Stewart's closest competitor in 1969. They were friends, real friends, the kind that only existed in that era because the alternative to friendship was dying among strangers. They raced together at Lotus. They fought through a championship that swung on mechanical failures and missed opportunities, and the particular violence of 2 men who understood each other's tactics too well to be surprised. Rindt won 6 times before Monza 1970 claimed him in a brake failure during practice. He became the only posthumous Formula One world champion. Stewart cried getting into the qualifying car 45 minutes later. Then he drove the fastest lap he had ever set at Monza. And yet, what Stewart said about Rindt over the years was not what he said about friends. He said Rindt was fast. He said the rivalry was fierce. He said, more quietly, that Rindt drove with an indifference to consequence that made him, at his best, almost impossible to follow. And at his worst, an argument against the philosophy Stewart was simultaneously trying to build. Rindt pushed machinery beyond what machinery wanted to absorb. He pushed at Spa. He pushed at Monza. The Lotus gave out. Whether that was fate or engineering, or the cumulative cost of a style that refused to negotiate, is a distinction Stewart never fully resolved. What he resolved was this: the fastest driver in any field is not always the one worth emulating. Sometimes the fastest driver in any field is a demonstration of what happens when a man refuses to draw the line that the circuit is drawing for him. Stewart drew the line. Every race, every lap, he drew it and he won, and then he walked away. One race before his 100th start, with a dead teammate behind him and 30 more years of watching ahead. He watched drivers take the liberties he refused. He watched championships won by men he believed were doing it wrong. He held his assessments like evidence, releasing them only when the statute of limitations on courtesy had expired. At 86, the courtesy is gone. What remains is the record, his own, and the one he has been quietly keeping on everyone else. The question is not whether Stewart's judgments are right. The question is what it means that a man who lost 57 friends to this sport still found room, inside all that grief, for something as precise and unforgiving as contempt. Contempt is not the product of indifference. It is the product of standards so specific and so costly that watching someone violate them, casually, repeatedly, across decades, becomes its own kind of wound. He never called them enemies. He called them wrong. In the language Jackie Stewart speaks, that is the harsher word.